ISBA is around for 20 years. I think ETBT we have done in the past, so we have via ISBA and via DST, ISBA has worked with Finance Ministry on certain tax incentive and so on and so forth. Occasionally something has come out of it, but it has not been taken as a formal approach that at least one or two formal publication can come out of ISBA, and that is very important now. After 20 years, ISBA is expected to do. We have more than 1,000 incubators in the country. Whether they are member or not, we do need to basically bring out, content, knowledge for everyone who is in the ecosystem. Yeah. So that's a larger context. Coming to this particular piece, so what I said was that now good part is that good news is that we are already at there. So yesterday Puran presented his findings, and it was very interesting finding for academia to take forward that what kind of now engagement they have with their recent alumni or students to convert them into entrepreneurship. It was a very good stats out there. Yeah. We early this year, Professor Rohan, me, and then Dr. Chintan Vaishnav, we wrote a white paper on sustainability piece. And that white paper basically had some context. Why did we write? Because we were doing some review of particular program, incubation centers under particular program. They all are young incubator, 3, 4, 5 years old incubators. And we could see, as Taran said, that they are doing commendable job. Yeah. The only missing piece was that we are getting grant for 4 or 5 years, and we have a good cushion out there. We get started with our work, but we don't think long term that how we become sustainable. So while we may have grant to sail us through for 3 to 4 years or 5 years or whatever it is, I think our sustainability and those pieces should start, sustainability activities should start from day one. So that was the whole idea. And we thought, we have enough experience amongst ourselves. In SINE, we had a great experience out there. So we said, we will, jot it down on the paper and then share with the community. That's one thing. Second thing is that, how do we take forward that? So research component, and especially coming from academia, I think it is highly undervalued in our ecosystem. There is a practice aspect, there is a research aspect, and these two sometimes are not really appreciated, how I would say, for mutual synergy out there. So that's where I thought, group, not only me, but the group coming together, we thought that let us make this vertical more research oriented out there. So I'll pass it to, we have 4 or 5 slides here. I think we would like to make it more conversational here. We will just run you through 4 or 5 slides, and we will go on question and answer. And many of the questions that was asked in previous session, I think we can address those as well. Yeah.
First of all, thanks for having me here, and thanks for the background, Dr. Suresh and Poyni. So what I'm going to speak about for just a couple of minutes is this piece that Poyni was talking about in terms of what is the role of knowledge and theory for practitioners. I think this is a conversation that's not very common, particularly in the Indian industry. We found it almost lacking in the incubation space. So I think one thing that is very well understood is that incubation management as a profession is still not formalized. This was referred to multiple times. There is no MBA degree, there is no diploma, there is no degree, there is not even a single certification program. And so largely learning and capacity building of incubation managers has happened in 2 ways. One is in forums like these or in workshops where practitioners come and share their experiences. And the other is, and some of you might have been in that bucket, where you get recruited into an incubator and you actually go on the job and you start learning on the job. Right? So on this slide, largely these two fall on the right of this chart, where the theory or the systematization component of this learning is very low. So either you learn from the stories of practitioners, which is the right bottom box here, which they have called the war story. So you have war heroes come and give their stories and you hear them. And I'm sure enough people have heard enough war stories in this room. And the other bucket is people who got recruited and learned on the job, which is basically the apprenticeship model, right? Now, what we are trying to emphasize is that the left side, where the theory interaction with the practice, right, is very important. And one thing that I want to very clearly separate out is that we are not talking about the bottom left box, which says bring you in a classroom and tell you some frameworks and say that now go into your job and do something about it. So that kind of learning is not very useful. That is where the notion of this is very academic comes from, because it's usually disconnected from practice. But the most optimal box is what we are trying to achieve is on the left top, right, where you have a very healthy component of actually practicing something, but effective doing requires a very systematic framework that is underlined by a lot of rigorous work, right? So not relying on experience of one practitioner or one story. It looks very nice when Steve Jobs stands on the stage and tells us this is how I did it. Then I go back to my startup and I'm like, now what do I do, right? And so that is the component that is very important to assess. And so that is, I think, one of the very important things that I wanted to just talk about, that practitioners have to think very deeply about what are the underlying mechanics of the discipline. And we've had this conversation a few times over the last 2-3 days. One of them was about, for example, student entrepreneurship, where the question was asked that at entry, 15% students have interest, at exit 30% students have interest. Why do you think this is happening? And as of now, the answer is we have no idea, because there have been hardly any systematic studies of what interventions affect student interest in what way. Most of what we are hearing is this is what my experience has been in my institute, and people are trying to kind of extrapolate that to certain areas, right? So I'll leave you with Kurt Lewin's quote on there is nothing as practical as a good theory. And so this is, I think, one thing that we're attempting, and Dr. Suresh mentioned about a capacity building and a certification program that we are planning to attempt, which will have this in mind. It won't be that you come, you hear some talks and then you go back, or, so this is going to be very hands-on. You come to a training program, you learn a framework, but then you sit for an hour and actually think about what does my incubator look like in terms of this framework, what do I do with it, and that kind of hands-on training. So one very key component, and I'll switch to the next slide, is that this kind of knowledge creation requires very deep collaboration between people who understand the theoretical world, the academic world, the research world, and the practitioners, right? And so one of the examples of this kind of a collaboration is the recent white paper that we wrote, where we had a collaboration between policy, Suchintan from Atal Innovation Mission, we had Poyni, who's everybody here knows very well, and me, who's coming from the more academic side, and we came together and thought that we'll write about financial sustainability of incubators, right? So we'll just give you, I think most of you have browsed through this paper, but we'll just give you a quick sense of what we have attempted to do in this paper.
I don't, how many have you browsed through that paper in this thing? Okay, and yeah, it's a very good number. And could you relate to it?
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. So we can go on the next thing. Just snapshot, there are only 2 slides giving, high level input out there. The thing is that, incubators, we are into service businesses. Yeah, we are not a product business that like a product nikala or becha. We are into service business. And like any service organization, we have multiple clientele, and we have to work on multiple, revenue sources. However, our core focus is on startup. So every activity we do essentially has to basically, has to benefit our startup. So that is the core premise out there. So when you talk about, our key stakeholder or our target customer, it is startup It is the industry partners or partnership program, then government or multilateral agencies, and then other entrepreneurship services organization where we do consulting, we write recommendation paper, or we do research for them, and so on and so forth. I think this is actually our client segment. And how do we earn from them? So startup, we can have like, initial basis, this incubation fee or rental or whatever. But I think real incubation impact would be visible only when you are able to leverage success of startup. So revenue share and equity is something that basically directly you have a share in the startup, success of the startup. Yeah, equity is very long term. Revenue could get started in 3 or 4 years, so it's a very short term, and plus success fee. So when you talk about startup, having 3 components, you can actually start initial earning from, 3rd and 4th year. Provided you have also played like a entrepreneur or business person. It's not just, giving rental space and whatever it is, but you have to actually invest in the startup. You have to actually leverage basically their success and start getting the funding. And another thing is that, initially your model would be, or rather revenue stream would be significantly different than as you go along. Because as you go along, equity will give you significantly higher returns, non-linear returns, and that would be your main revenue stream. So one equity return perhaps can take 2 or 3 failure and 2 or 3 years in coming years. Yeah, so that's a non-linear this thing. So this is the matrix, and what we feel is a mature incubator necessarily, 50 to 70% should come from startup, and another 50% can come from other stakeholders. So this is where we have done. When you are in early years, this percentage go aage piche, but at a maturity level, this should be the model. And let me tell you, this is not only science model. We haven't done any formal research, but by working and observing and sitting on committee and seeing about 200, 300 incubators, I think this is feasible and this can be achieved. That is how we recommend it.
So I'm going to talk about 2 of them very quickly. One is, what do incubators do, and how do they transition to becoming equity investors? So this is a very sensitive topic in the ecosystem, particularly whenever I speak to incubator managers, because they are like, startups equity nahi dete hai, startup se equity milna bahut mushkil hai. And this is a very important thing to understand, because for me personally, this is the last test of the value addition of incubators. If you are able to get equity, the real fuel of any startup is equity, right? And if you are able to partake in the equity share, that it's a very significant milestone for your incubator, because that somebody is parting with their most valuable resource. And so this is very important to try and achieve for a lot of the incubators, right? So this is something that's a little important. So this, of course, chart shows a very simple, we have talked about what kind of equity shares incubators can take. Typically 3 to 5% is something that can be considered for incubation equity. Of course, if you're a new incubator, you have limited value addition, you might want to begin with by taking smaller stakes, because that's the only thing that would, good quality startups would not part with 3, 4, 5% of their equity, depending on who you are. But let's assume that you take 4% stake in an equity, and this is actually an anonymized real example. You can see that as the startup actually succeeds, your stake, the range of your stake can go anywhere from 32 lakh to 6 crore. That's what the last sort of column talks about. Of course, typically this is not how your stake would look like. At various stages, you would sell part of your equity stakes. Let's say there is a next round of funding. It's a decent enough valuation. You as an incubator also need a little bit of money. The investors also want to make a little bit of room on the cap table. So you would sell shares at different points in time. And of course, the final revenue that you get or the final payoff that you get from your equity stake would vary depending on how you exit over a period of time, right? But this is kind of just a showcase of what it can look like. The other part is, I believe, much easier to do and something that incubators can begin with before they can actually start taking equity in their startups, which is revenue sharing. Now, typically, if you have 2 or 3 years of incubation in your incubator, you can have a similar matching period where you say that once you start making revenue, you have to share a percentage of that with us over a similar, let's say, 3-year duration. But there are a few things that you need to take care of here. For example, you need to mention something called as a floor. So you say that you have to make at least a certain amount of revenue in a certain year for you to actually share that with us. So let's assume that in the next year you just make a revenue of 1 lakh rupees. That year doesn't really count very well, right? So you have to at least make 30 lakh rupees of revenue in a year for it to count as a revenue sharing year, and we'll, let's say, take 3% of it, right? So this is some of the arrangements, but at the same time, revenue sharing comes with a cap. So you can't say that if you make 500 crore of revenue, we get 3% of that as well. That becomes very difficult to achieve. So it comes with a very natural cap that you say that no matter how much revenue you make, we will only take 3% of 1 crore, right, at max. And so this is where the revenue model differs from the equity model, because your upside is also capped. But this can give you money much earlier than equity in terms of your operational expenses.
The thing is that, as I mentioned, I just repeat that revenue share you can get started very early on, and your return can start coming and directly linked to the success of the startup. Your equity is something you leave it for the longer period. So I would say, kind of fee, revenue share, partially success fee could be your, bread and butter. Equity is your jackpot. And that's how you have to play around. Yeah.
All right. So one last slide. So based on this, we have written for a bunch of forums based on some of these research reports, but also for wider circulation. And there is more coming. So we wrote an article based on our white paper with Poyni and Chintan, and Poyni and me have been writing articles for Forbes. She's of course been writing the blog on ISBA's website for quite some time. So do watch this space for more content, and do share your feedback. And I am personally very interested in hearing, when you go to the field, what kind of challenges have you found in applying some of the things that we are writing? Because like I said, that's where the real impact of practically useful knowledge comes from. When somebody actually goes to the field and said, I tried to do what you said, and A worked and B didn't work, right? So, all right. So I think that's about it.
To stay informed about the startup ecosystem, subscribe to My Startup TV.